Sounds good. Well, we're going to have a mix of narrative and some wonderful images, and I'll talk about each of the images as they come up, too. Just want to begin with, I was just marveling when I was putting this talk together, what a place we live in. 2 national parks, a national preserve just beyond our borders, and untold other things that really point out how unique this area is. So we are living in a subtropical paradise in many ways. We won't mention that during the summer, but other than that, I mean, it's just fantastic. When I was younger as a kid, the summers never bothered me at all, but it changes a little bit now. So here we are, and all of this for a county that counted less than 900 people as late as 1890. In fact, the county at that time stretched from the northern Florida Keys to the St. Lucie Inlet and deep inland. Today, there's more than 6 million people in that area, to show you the difference in growth and all. Okay, just kind of pick it up then, you think? Might be the best thing? Okay, let me go ahead and just detach this, and I have the little clicker here too. So we've sometimes heard the lament that the soil is too sandy here with oolitic limestone too close to the surface to produce a richness necessary for successful farming, but the reality is that the output of small communities of farmers from the lower parts of Biscayne Bay all the way up to the edge of Biscayne Bay in the north, with supposedly bad soil has been really impressive. Impressive over time, not just today, not just in the early 1900s, but even in the late 19th century, we saw that. Most of the farming communities of early Dade County looked out at the luminous Biscayne Bay, and what a bay it is, 39 miles north and south, 3 to 9 miles in width, very shallow in most places, except those that have been dredged. This served as, in many ways, the county as an early expressway, a source of water, of food. Further, it knitted together an area which at best offered just primitive surface roads within a particular community, not really connecting one community with another. So the way to get around in the minds of a lot of people was a place they called Bay Country. Get in a sailboat, weren't any motorboats for the most part during that time, and just sail from one community to another. There's a famous picture we have in our collection, History Miami, where people from Coconut Grove are at Julia Tuttle's home on the north bank of the Miami River at the mouth, and they're having lunch there. It's a Sunday lunch. So they have sailed from Coconut Grove over to the mouth of the river for this occasion. So we've got the bay, and the bay is really the key to understanding these farming communities. Humanity began way down in deep South Dade in terms of humanity in this area. We know there's archaeological evidence going back to human beings in the area more than 10,000 years ago, artifacts that have been uncovered and test dated more than 10,000 years old, and this is unbelievable. This is a place that always had the knock, it's too young to have a history. Well, the reality is people have been living here for hundreds of generations. We talked earlier about the DeQuestas, among others, but even their forebears go back thousands of years earlier than that. The area in deep South Dade where these excavations were was right around the Charles Daring estate, the artifacts around the monkey jungle after Hurricane Andrew. And it's interesting because this area appears on late 19th century maps, early 20th century maps as the Indian hunting ground, sometimes the big Indian hunting ground, because this is where a lot of native Miamians going way back in time, according to accounts that we've read over time, this is where they hunted. And it really had everything you needed, I think, for human habitation. What you had here was high ground, that's critical in terms of flooding and also just predators that might bother you, have a little more difficult time probably coming after you on elevated ground. It's near the bay, very, very important. And the woods were filled with game. It could be wild turkey, it could be boar, I mean, just venison all over the place. And so it really attracted a lot of people, as it did in the 19th century with farming. In fact, we can fast forward to the recent past, going from 10,000 years to 150 years ago. As early as 1844, a man named Reason Duke, who was one of the early lighthouse keepers, Cape Florida Lighthouse, which opened in 1825, he was probably the third in line of the lighthouse keepers. And he actually claimed 160 acres at the big Indian hunting grounds, or the big hunting grounds, whatever you want to call it, back in 1844. Because the American government had passed a series of acts going back to the 18 teens to encourage people to move into or settle in desolate areas. And what they held out was the offer of essentially free land. And so Reason Duke took advantage of that. And this is one of the earlier predecessor is what we call the Homestead Act of 1862. So here he is in 1844. He's raising vegetables down there, and this would be somewhere in the vicinity of today's Charles Daring Estate, and planted sisal hemp, which is a very coarse fiber used in making rope. Orange groves appeared in other parts of the hunting grounds in that era, while the amount of sisal hemp, not only not only raised by Rees and Duke, but also by other people who came to the area, at one point, about 6,000 plants were under cultivation, creating that. And that became one of the, I can't use the word big, but one of the more important industries or enterprises in the Miami of that era. Even with portions of the land surface underwater at certain times of the year in other parts of South Dade, which caused a lot of flooding, of course, not conducive to farming, people streamed into the area and they farmed. And so when we look at South Dade prior to the 1940s and all, a lot of the area today that's rich farmland wasn't even really drained at that time. We call them glades. And drainage occurs throughout much of the middle decades of the 20th century, making land that's much more viable for raising crops. Most noteworthy of the visitors who came to the Indian hunting grounds after Rees and Duke and others, going back to the period of the Civil War, was a couple, Mary and John Addison. They had lived in St. Augustine, and they moved down to the wilds of South Florida. And it's interesting to just get an idea of what they were raising in terms of crops. They were squatters. They were squatting on land in the Charles Daring Estate. In fact, I could probably take you to the approximate area where they lived, on that ridge overlooking the bay. As you're moving away from the house, you're moving north, away from the Daring house. And they raised oranges, lemons, limes, bananas, pineapples, mangoes, and vegetables on their property, arriving there in 1864 during the American Civil War, in fact. And although they lived there for several decades, in fact, Mary Addison is buried in the Pinewood Cemetery off of Sunset and Irwin Road, in technically Coral Gables. A lot of people consider that part of South Miami. But Mary really disliked the isolation, yet she gutted it out for about 3 or 4 decades. In fact, on one occasion, she complained of the loneliness of her location. She said, and I quote, "I'm used to the best society." She was telling a visitor this, "and I never shall get used to this place." Most important among the farming communities in the late 19th century South Dade that centered near and around the hunting grounds was the unincorporated settlement of Cutler, which is a portion of today's Palmetto Bay. You know, it's kind of confusing because there is a Cutler also. This Cutler was in today's Palmetto Bay. And it was also part of a 36 square mile township, which entails scores of thousands of acres, that was given in the mid-1830s by the U.S. government to a Dr. Perrine, Henry Perrine. And he was going to raise subtropical plants on that site. He came from New York, he'd been down in Cuba, he was over in Mexico, and just really became enamored of that whole agricultural scene there. He never was able to activate this. He was actually killed during the Second Seminole War down at Indian Key, which was the first county seat of Dade County, which was only created in early 1836. And so the United States government, after being contacted by Henry Perrine Jr., saying, "Look, give us another chance. You know, my father was killed during this Indian War. What can we do to come back on these claims?" And so it said, "Okay, if you can bring a community down and sustain a community there and raise crops and make it viable, we'll consider or reconsider giving you that land again." Perrine came down from New York with a group of guys and their families, and they tried to farm, just couldn't cut it. And so they kind of gave up the ghost, never really picked that land up. And so really you had a place then that might have been settled as far back as the 1830s, but now it's in hiatus at that point. Why don't we do this? Let's look at a couple of the images while we're doing this. They're in no particular order until we get down to Vizcaya itself, but I just wanted to pick up on this. I've got so much to talk about tonight in a finite amount of time. How about this here? Miami Beach Orchard mangoes. Look at this here. Now, what's interesting about this here is John Collins, who was in many ways the father of Miami Beach. He owned much of the future city of Miami Beach. He was cultivating at one point, he came down as part of a coconut plantation experiment, and I'm going to lay that out for you. But he was cultivating avocados on the west side of the Indian Creek, straddling what would be today's 41st Street along Pine Tree Drive. And lo and behold, Here's something different. This comes a little bit later, the Miami Beach Orchard. And the crates are important because so many tourists who came down here would have crates sent back home. Just, I guess, to upset their families, saying they're down in the sun and look at all the stuff that's happening. You know, they're shipped back to Philadelphia from here. So you'll find that even small enterprises always had like a logo on their crates, where it came from. And this is a painting of Henry Flagler's train reaching Miami in 1896, mid-April of 1896. As late as 1895, there were just 9 people living at the mouth of the river on both banks, the Brickles and the Tuttles. This train changed everything. You'd have an incorporated city in July of roughly 700 people. And this is a map, I believe it's 1903, that shows you the lower parts of Biscayne Bay with Cutler down here, Coconut Grove here, and a lot of times when you looked at maps of that period, I don't see it here, but they would have the big Indian hunting ground here, and they'd have a little hunting ground at Coconut Grove. Look at the way Coconut's spelled, C-O-C-O-A-N-U-T. That's the way they spelled it at the time that they got going in the 1870s. That's when they got a post office. And a Union doctor actually gave it its name. He looked around, as the story goes, saw 2 coconut palm trees and said, we're going to call this Coconut Grove. Talk about hyperbole. But when Coconut Grove incorporated as a city at the end of the 1910s, Dr. David Fairchild was there and says, guys, you got to correct the spelling of this name. It's C-O-C-O-N-U-T, not C-O-C-O-A-N-U-T, so that's when it changed. But this map just kind of lays out some of the communities and some of the settlement between Cutler, where the Charles Dairy Estate is today, in Coconut Grove itself, and then a little further up, you're getting close to where we are right now, in fact. Let's look at one more, we'll come back to the lecture after that. Pineapple, sometimes called pines. Big export item here, growing all over the place. They could be up in today's North Miami Beach, they could be down in today's Little Havana. It didn't matter, they're all over the place. And really a rich fruit. You know, it's interesting, as late as the 1960s in Pompano Beach, they still had pineapple orchards there. And sometimes people who were staying down here, there were trips arranged, tours arranged, where they would bring them up to take a look at these orchards. Again, you know, you come from Philadelphia, you're looking at pineapples, and this is unbelievable. So we'll just kind of leave it at that, though, but that's a major export product right there. I wanted to get back and look at Cutler a little more. By the 1890s, Cutler was, and again, the Charles Dairy Estate area, was among the largest settlements in vast, sprawling Dade County with more than 300 residents. A general store, which was where everybody went to. In fact, the post office was in the general store. And people came from all over to pick up their mail or buy supplies, and the predominant supplies were all farm-related supplies. You know, these grain and feed stores. Behind it were the warm waters of Biscayne Bay, and there were docks there, where people like Tom Peters, who was the so-called tomato king of Dade County. At one time, he had thousands of acres and raising, cultivating tomatoes. Well, he would bring his crops down there to the docks. There were 2 docks down there in the bay, just beyond the Charles Dairy Estate itself, and that was the main way in that area to move products to market before the railroad came. And then there was a couple inland communities, and these people really gutted it out. Silver Palm and Redland, let's look at that. Cutler was even a draw for these people because they could get their mail there, they had to get their mail there, they could also buy supplies there, whatever they needed. And so Silver Palm and Redland were situated far away from there. It was an all-day trek to get there. Located at and spreading beyond the crossroads of today's Newton Road and Silver Palm Drive, Silver Palm is a community named for the sort of silver sheen on the back of a variety of palm trees, known as silver palms. And they grew in profusion in that area. It's high ground. It's not too far from, at that point, the edge of the Everglades in that area. People lived there, and somehow they made it go. It was about 12 miles from Cutler. The soil there lacked richness because the rock beneath it was so close to the surface. But the people that lived there worked diligently to make up for their sufficiency. Good irrigation systems, fertilizers, and of course a lot of hard work. Really kind of made that a viable place. They farmed a wide variety of crops. And again, early on we see the versatility of the crops here. Guava trees grew wild there, but they also raised tomatoes and beans and citrus trees. In fact, the guavas oftentimes were processed by the wives in the community to make guava jelly. You know, and they would put them in jars and what have you, and that became an item that was also shipped out for sale. There were venison and quail in the woods, abundantly so, in the piney woods surrounding the settlement, as was the cycad plant and its root, known by the Indian terminology of Compti or Kunti, made into a starch. So the root of a cycad plant that was processed, ground to remove anything toxic in it, and eventually it becomes like a fine powder. It's used to kind of beef up soups. That's what a lot of Native Americans did. But also you could use it as starch and ironing. And that became the #1 cash crop in the 19th century in Dade County. When I say Dade County, then of course we're going far up too. Today's Broward, today's Palm Beach counties, and even beyond that. And if you think there was farming in Dade County, Broward was still very rural at the time that Dade County began to see cities and towns emerge. So it was really rich farming up there. 2 miles southwest of Silver Palm lies Redland. So named for the red soil containing clay and marl. Marl is like a mixture of clay and lime. Gives off a reddish tinge. In fact, it's a really rich farming belt that stretched 5 miles north from the community of Homestead and about 2 to 3 miles in width. And that was really the richest area. It's kind of like the equivalent of the black belt that goes through parts of Alabama and different parts of the South Georgia, where the farming was really at its best because of the richness of the soil. So you have Redland. And Redland's interesting because it was briefly incorporated and then it was disincorporated, all of this in the 1910s. And they picked the term Redland because of the tinge on the soil. But it's also important because Redland becomes, if you put an S at the end of it, Redlands, it becomes a generic name for that huge farming belt from Florida City all the way up, believe it or not, to Kendall. We'll describe Kendall a little later on too, and how that was horse country and farm country really until the end of the 1950s, which is hard to imagine. There's hundreds of thousands of people living there now. So you've got these inland people that are working hard, an all-day trek, 12 miles away. You might spend the night in Cutler and head back the next day. You're just too tired to go 12 miles back. You're going to get caught in darkness anyway. But they did it. I think it was a farmer's paradise there. By the late 1890s, Samuel H. Richmond, Dr. Richmond, never was a physician. He was a man who started med school, and it turned out he didn't have a sense of smell. So he dropped out of med school after the first day. But everybody continued to call him Dr. Richmond. But he worked for Henry Flagler, like so many other people did, and he was representing the Flagler organization, who was trying to pick up a chunk of the Prime land grant. Worked out of the federal government. Flagler had great lobbyists, great influence all over the place, and he did pick up a chunk of land, Flagler did, which represented part of the old Prime land grant. Dr. Richmond was the guy that did it. He was also dredging a lot of acreage in that Prime thing because during the rainy season it really flooded. Again, it had several glades in it. Again, these low-lying areas that pick up a lot of water. You know, it's interesting, just as I digress for a second, we're going to get to Coral Gables in a minute. When you read the story of Coral Gables, where the golf course is the Granada Country Club golf course, which was the oldest golf course here. It's a 9-hole golf course. And it's kind of low-lying. You really don't appreciate it. It's a glade. But when we had those terrible floods, there was a tropical storm that came in the 1990s. I can't remember the name of the thing. There have been so many storms and hurricanes. I want to say Irene, but I'm not sure. But long story short, for whatever reason, I was riding by Coral Way, heading parallel to where the country club is, where the golf course is. It was completely underwater, and this was about 7 days after the storm. Then I got a real appreciation for what a glade is. Well, Richmond's over here in the Prime grant, and he's already beginning drainage because the Flagler people want to put this to use. They want to create a town and sell town lots, build a commercial center there too. So a lot of things are going on there. There was also prairie land in the area of Cutler, which was of soft clay and loam mixture. A prairie land, I guess the easiest, most simple definition of a prairie land is it's a wide open space without any trees, or at least trees of any height. In other words, you can be driving through a forest and suddenly there's this wide open place, and it's Mother Nature. And so you had prairie land down there also, and the soil happened to be especially rich there. Dr. Richmond was used to it. Dr. Richmond became aware of it, And one farmer said that because of the makeup of the clay and the loam mixture, that once you have begun to dig it, prepare it for farming, it's like I'm quoting, a fine soft bed upon the first time plowing. After the water is drained off to allow its cultivation, there are thousands of acres of it. So heavy farming then, and part of this prime land grant, again, in South Dade, including Cutler at that time, which would be Palmetto Bay today, was moving forward as drainage began. And this is way back at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Cutler's great success with icons like Tom Peters, the tomato king we just mentioned, with his thousands of acres of tomato under cultivation, set the stage for South Dade's ascendancy. And by the early 1900s, people are just kind of speaking about that and all in terms of its farming, and they're referring to it as the Redlands. In fact, the most important newspaper down there was the Redlands something, I can't remember the last part of the name, but it was always the Redlands, and that paper was there for decades. The farming output was dazzling, both in the quantity of goods and in the variety. For instance, Dr. William Cutler, for whom the community was named, cleared 100 acres of his property for cultivation and planted 100,000 pineapple plants, 1,000 coconut trees, 500 orange trees, and a variety of fruit trees. Cutler employed black Bahamians in the arduous process of developing the property. Since the terrain of southeast Florida is so similar to the Bahamas, these folks are very conversant in the ways to handle it. In fact, they helped and taught a lot of other farmers how to farm in this area with the rocks close to the surface of the land. The aforementioned Richmond's property in Cutler also illustrates how great the area was for cultivating a vast variety of crops, because Dr. Richmond himself grew the following trees and plants: fruit and ornamental trees, alligator pears. Anybody know what an alligator pear is? Avocado. And they probably used that term more than they did avocado once upon a time, which is hard to imagine. Camphor, bananas, 3 varieties of figs. This is all on Dr. Richmond's property. 4 varieties of grapes, 3 varieties of common guava, 2 varieties of Catalay guava, a common lime, Spanish lime, red plum, Kelsey plum, pomegranate, coffee tree, fig tree, plus mangoes, olives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it was really productive. It didn't take long. By the end of the 19th century, this place is just booming in terms of farm crops, and it accelerates as we go on into the 20th century. The foundation thus had been set for a flourishing farming region that would take us to the next century and beyond. A great boon for this expansion appeared with the extension of Henry Flagler's Railroad. The railroad entered Miami. As I mentioned before, in 1896. And it dead-ended on the north bank of the river. It didn't cross the river until 1901, and very quickly it moved. If you look at US 1 today, it runs, for the most part, parallel to the FEC right-of-way. The FEC was there before the Dixie Highway was there, or US 1. So it runs through there, and in the process, it begins to create communities, and very significant communities, too, as we'll see very shortly. So it's going to be a great push to enhance the size of these farming communities down in South Dade and the output. And now you can move crops by rail, so much more effective than moving it by boat. New rich farming communities arose along the right-of-way, especially at its stations, at its depots, at its sidings. And they included such important agricultural communities as Homestead, which was complete wilderness until 1903, 1904. Florida City, known initially as Detroit. Kendall, Granja, Goulds, Princeton, huge farming communities. All the result of the railroad coming through there. There's stops, there's depots, what have you, along the way there. The resourceful Tom Peters, in fact, had actually built a sort of like a wooden train system that would connect from where his tomato farms were down to the docks at the Charles Daring Estate. Now with the train coming through, he's built a spur that comes off the main line of the FEC railway right to his tomato groves. So he's able to move things very quickly to market in that respect. The railroad's right-of-way also saw the rise of an important packing house district, or what they call a row. That is, you're preparing these things for shipment. Now you're going to wrap them up, say tomatoes, very carefully. You're going to crate them, and you're going to put them in a train car. So that becomes a big thing. And you can see some of these packing houses even today as you drive past Princeton and other parts of South Dade. Tomato-rich Googles could boast of 5 vegetable and fruit packing houses as well as a ketchup factory utilizing surplus tomatoes. Also, with the operation of the railroad, market goods could be carried by train to markets more rapidly than by water, as we mentioned already. For its part, Kendall hosted something called the Flagler Groves. Kendall had a stop station. It was a vast acreage of citrus crops created by Henry Flagler on land given the railroad by the state of Florida. For every mile he extended the railroad, typically he got about 1,000 acres on both sides of the right-of-way. And in some cases, people who wanted that railroad to come through or close to their property, they would award them land, like Julia Tuttle did and like Mary Brickell did on both sides of the Miami River. So Flagler creates something called Flagler Groves at this point, and it's really to promote the sale of land he has down here. The groves were designed to illustrate the value of the agricultural land in the area. So he had a large farm on part of that property he was showcasing, just to bring people into the area and hopefully sell them on it. Adding to the growing size of South Dade's agricultural belt was the federal government's actions in 1898. They opened up an area from deep South Dade around Florida City of today all the way up into the area close to Silver Palm for farmers to pick up as much as 160 acres under something called the Homestead Act of 1862. And all they had to do was they had to live on it essentially most of the time, of the 5-year period, build something on it, perhaps raise a small amount of crops on it, and then when they applied for ownership of it after 5 years, they paid something called a proving up fee, which is about $13. And those 160 acres, or sometimes less than that, became theirs. Let me go ahead and shift gears and look a little bit at some more of the images we have up here on the screen. This is interesting here. You got, this is great, a boy holding turnips, 1926. This is absolutely amazing. I mean, they start them out young. And here we got again the mango thing, Miami Beach Orchard. We saw that on the cover in a crate, 1926. The beach had only incorporated as a community in 1915. And at this point, this is interesting because at this point the beach is really touting itself, realistically so, as a tourist center, and it was. Carl Fisher was building these great hotels on the Bayside. This is Dr. David Fairchild, the guru of horticulture, subtropical in particular. Always of great help. The inspiration for Fairchild Tropical Gardens. In fact, that land, 83 acres, was given to the county by a man who lived next door to his name. His slips are right now, but he was a very prominent businessman and CPA, and he really liked Robert Montgomery. Thank you. And he gave it because of his dedication, his belief in the good stuff that Dr. Fairchild was doing. Fairchild, of course, would live at the Camp Pond, which has its own history. There's so many different people that have lived there over time. And now we have Dr. Charles, he had an honorary also, Dr. Charles Torrey Simpson, who did not even finish high school, but was given this honorific because of his achievements. We'll talk about him a little later on, a marvelous conchologist, stones, plants. He lived right on the edge of what would be today American Legion Park off of Biscayne Boulevard in the 80s blocks of Northeast Miami. And he grew up in Indiana, just really happy to be down here. His funeral was interesting. He was such a prominent person in the community at that time that the funeral cortege went from his house, where there had been a ceremony, again in Northeast Miami, long procession all the way down to Woodlawn Park Cemetery where he was buried. In fact, they planted one of his trees next to him. It may still be there. We'll just kind of leave it here. We'll come back to this in just a little while. I just want to get into some of the other communities, kind of leave deep South Dade if we can. We've talked about the Homestead Act of 1862. We talked about the tremendous assistance that workers from the Bahamas, both white and black farmers, were responsible for in that area. Let me move now to the transformational real estate boom of the mid-1920s and what it does for the area. Because during that great boom, and we're right now on the cusp of the centennial of the great real estate boom that transformed this whole area. It hit its peak in the late summer of 1925, had an impact in Deep South Dade as well as other places. By the mid-20s then, the Redland District, or the Redlands as many people call it, remained a great agricultural center as homesteads served as the trade nexus for the smaller towns and farming communities in the region. The scale of agricultural operations increased significantly. The most important crops in Deep South Dade and in many other parts of the farming life of Miami-Dade County, then called Dade County, the most important crops began with tomatoes. In many other places, it had been oranges, and now tomatoes seem to supplant them as the most important cash crop. At harvest time in 1925, for example, to show you how the scale has grown so enormously, you went from family-worked farms. 1925, 5,000 persons were working in the tomato fields in and around the city of Homestead. And it's probably an early version of what we're going to know later as migrant laborers come into the area. People come from outside of the area for the sake of jobs. And that really accelerates at the end of World War II and thereafter. In the waning decades of the 1900s, South Dade was responsible for, again, to show you the growth through the recent past, 95% of the county's productive farmland, South Dade. It ranked 9th nationally regarding the acreage of vegetables harvested for sale, 11th in the value of vegetables sold. The county, but specifically South Dade, ranked #1 nationally in acreage of snap beans that were harvested for sale. On the eve of Hurricane Andrew in 1992, the county was responsible for 90% of the nation's supply of limes and mangoes. South Dade was also the country's largest winter producer of tomatoes, with an estimated 12,000 acres in production. And it's interesting to note that after World War II, a man named Arthur Vining Davis came here, and he was this huge success story. He'd been chairman of Alcoa, Aluminum Company of America. When he died in 1962, his estate was valued at $400 million then. So you can imagine what it'd be like today. He started buying up land all over the place. He was making the purchase of about 1 or 2 purchases a week by the mid-1950s. Well, a lot of the land he bought, thousands of acres, was farmland in Deep South Dade. And much of that was in tomato production. And there was this really brutal, at least by Miami standards, freeze in 1958 that really wiped out a lot of his tomato crop. It certainly didn't wipe out his fortune, but it had a big impact on terms of the growth in that area. So we've got an area that is absolutely booming. Just to look a little further than this, we had the most productive area in the country was right here in terms of tropical vegetables. A major portion of the state's ornamental foliage. Most of the eastern seaboard's fresh winter vegetables came from Deep South Dade. Many varieties of ornamental plants and trees emanated from Deep South Dade. From the middle decades of the 1900s on, migrant laborers, we hinted at that before, were a major source of the workers in that area. And during harvest time, there would be thousands in the area. While new housing and retail development was encroaching in a substantial way on many pieces of land that had been cultivated up until that time, South Dade remained nonetheless one of the rare examples of great farmland flourishing in a major metropolitan area. It's just unique in that respect. The consolidation of farming operations also grew significantly, so that by the end of the 1900s, the area west of US 1, between Homestead and Cutler Ridge, contained 10 large farms on plots exceeding 2,000 acres apiece, with tomatoes or beans their chief crops. At the same time, 6 agribusinesses controlled tomato, lime, and avocado fields of 1,000 acres or more. So it's these mega farms that have appeared in the area. And that trend sets in the late 1900s and has continued through the present. And then if we move a little bit north, we had our map before, we'll just kind of leave it as it is right now. We moved north along the bay to a place called Larkins. Where was Larkins? Well, initially, it was centered about where Cocoa Plum Circle is today. And it was named for a Tennessee family who moved to the wilds of South Dade, Sam Larkins and his family. They cultivated a wide variety of crops. They also had a big dairy farm. In fact, they provided the milk for the Royal Palm Hotel, Henry Flagler's hotel down at the north bank of the river in downtown Miami. It was, today it would be a 5-star plus hotel. And the milk came from Larkins. But the Larkin family and other people in Larkins were smart enough to understand once the railroad came through, it bypassed that Cocoa Plum Circle area. So what happened then? Larkins moved to today's, the nexus would have been US 1 and about Sunset Drive. That became the unofficial center of the community, whose name would change over time when it incorporated as South Miami. So you've got then Larkins as a very productive area too, Cocoa Plum Circle. And we mentioned the old cemetery. The old cemetery, in fact, is very close to the circle itself. So during the transformational real estate boom of the mid-1920s, Redland District, or the Redlands themselves, remain, as I mentioned before, such an important part of the whole farming operation of the area. But things are changing, and other areas, I think, really kind of deserve some mention too. But before we leave Larkins, I wanted to mention something really interesting. Cocoa Plum Circle. There was a general store there run by the Larkin family. Sam Larkin and his family had a whole bunch of children. And a lot of times, nobody was in the store. So you could go in the store, take out whatever you want, and just, write a little note what you've taken from the store. Next time you saw Mr. Larkins, you would pay him for it. It was strictly on the honor system. I just wonder how far they get today with that. Guavas were big there too, in Larkins. In fact, there was a man, they created a jelly industry there, guava jelly. A man named William Leash and his family farmed 20 acres of guavas along today's Sunset Drive, which actually was created by bringing prisoners out of a jail and having them crush rocks to create that road that came off of US 1 heading down in the direction of the bay itself. And it's interesting because it was a grandiose title for their guava factory. It was called the Royal Guava Jelly Factory. And this resourceful family also created orange marmalade from their orange groves. And then we have the Merricks. Now again, so much of the action's along the bay, but there are people working inland, like the people in Silver Palm. And the Merrick family was an amazing family. The Reverend Solomon Greasley Merrick was not a happy person. And he kind of leaned really heavily on his oldest son, George Merrick, and they picked up an estate of 160 acres, homestead estate of 160 acres, where the Coral Gables house is today at 907 Coral Way. And there were so many guava trees that were growing wild there, the Merricks called it Guavonia, but they began to farm. And they farmed very well. All sorts of vegetables, the guavas, of course, they processed that. George Merrick, as a young guy, teenager, would get up at 2 in the morning, get into a donkey-driven cart, and take crates of whatever produce they wanted to sell to downtown Miami, oftentimes to the river itself where they'd be shipped somewhere, or to the train station, which was downtown. And they amassed a tremendous amount of money. The Reverend Solomon Greasley Merrick had passed away, so George becomes really the leader of the family in many ways. And the family decided that really the action was more in grapefruit groves. And so they began to concentrate on developing grapefruits. They had about 520 acres of land by the early 1900s. They started with 160 acres. And they started selling grapefruits. And they became the largest shipper of grapefruits in Florida and made not even a small fortune. For example, their financial statement in 1914 indicated that George, the oldest sibling, and his widowed mother, Althea, who designed the house that we see at 907 Coral Way, owned, at that point, 560 acres of land and had a net worth of $312,000, which is around $8 million in today's money. Less than 1 decade later, George was building his own magical city of Coral Gables. Very entrepreneurial, very creative. And then if you go a little farther down the bay, you're heading in a northerly direction toward downtown, you get to Coconut Grove. Coconut Grove, several miles east of the Merricks. The Merricks were really landlocked, and yet they worked hard. And it's interesting to note that when the Merricks got there, that was an area where the government had designated as a place where you had eligibility to pick up 160 acres. So there were several 160-acre farms. Many of the farmers were white Bahamians in that area that owned those 160 acres. So the Merricks found themselves among a bunch of people that they had never come across before, coming from the Northeast. They lived in Massachusetts. George was born in Pennsylvania, what have you. So we've got Coconut Grove then, moving a little bit farther in the direction of downtown Miami. Arguably the most avant-garde, the most advanced of all the communities, I think, in Dade County in the late 19th, early 20th century. And it was a large community, relatively speaking. There were more than 100 people living in Coconut Grove, according to the U.S. Census in 1890, whereas the future city of Miami, at least the mouth of the river, had just one family, the Brickles. Julia Tuttle hadn't arrived until 1891 to the area. And so you had some really accomplished, interesting people, eccentric people, accomplished people that came from all over. You had 2 titled counts. You had a writer of boys' stories. You had the son of Harriet Beecher Stowe. It just goes on and on. Some of the people that settled in Coconut Grove in the 1880s, in and around the Peacock Inn. But we don't want to lose the fact that it was also a rich farming community. There were Kunti roots being processed just beyond the Peacock Inn. And then if you look at a map of Coconut Grove in that era, you can see that the Peacock Inn and the area next to the bay where the Peacock Inn sat were encircled by fruit groves as well as just regular farms on all sides of it. So I've got to move a little faster, but I just wanted to get that plug in with Coconut Grove. But you know, I think I've got the hint because it's getting dark up here. But I'm okay, I'm fine. But let's go to some more images here. This is interesting here, the great profusion of crops here. Florida City, circa 1922, picking tomatoes. Look at this here. Florida City was literally and figuratively not on the map until the railroad got down there in 1904. And again, it was called Detroit initially. The idea was on the part of the developer there to bring 30 prominent Detroit families, preferably physicians, to the wilds of South. Who in the right mind would come down to the wilds of South Dade when you're, well, whatever. The weather's better, that's for sure. But look at this here. And then you've got the plows. Plowing a tomato field near Florida City, same time. Matlack was a prominent Miami photographer. This is interesting to hear. You got Sarah McLean, known as the Ox Woman. She was 6'4". She came from a family of, for lack of a better term, giants. Her father was said to be the biggest man in South Georgia, both height-wise and girth-wise. She had 4 sisters, all of whom were over 6 feet tall. She was 6'4". And she came across state and was selling meat up and down the lower part of the map, in other words, the Redlands. And then suddenly she passed away. But here she was, the Ox Woman of South Dade, as she was called. This is a Depression era thing, Tomato Picker's Homestead. Literally a backbreaking job. More of this here. You can see the baskets here waiting to be filled or replenished with tomatoes. Early 1900s. This is interesting. This building's still standing. The Redland Farm Life Consolidated School. There were about 7 schools in these little communities. Silver Palm had a school. I can't call it elementary or middle school or high school. It was just everybody would attend these schools. The teacher had to be really versatile. But there were about 7 different schools. And by the mid-1910s, they had created this Redland Consolidated Farm Life School. They closed those schools, and everybody came to this particular school, and they were often bused to the school. So there used to be farm kids primarily. It suffered damage from hurricanes. Last time I looked, I think it was doing okay, though. Is that right? Oh, okay, thank you. Oh, my gosh. This is a luxury. I felt like I was in deep South Dade before electricity, before that. This is great. Let's get another look at one more image, and we'll come back to this. This is Redland Grocery, yes. And this would be sometime, I think, in the mid-1930s. Again, a little community. All of them had their versions of downtowns and what have you. So we've looked then at Coconut Grove very briefly. I wanted to mention that where Dr. David Fairchild was settled was also the place where Dr. Eleanor Galt Simmons, a physician, and her husband A.R. Simmons had settled before then. And like the Leishes in Cocoa Plum, they manufactured guava jelly on their property. Black Bahamians found their way to the Grove also in the 1890s, and they created a vibrant community. We know that, we've known it as West Grove, today Little Bahamas, and those people were so adept at all kind of maritime work, so adept at planting in that sandy soil. Very, very interesting community. It grew to be about 12 families by the end of the 1890s, and those numbers continue to grow. Like farmers elsewhere, many farmers in Coconut Grove acquired, again, the 160 acres. So the areas that surrounded what would be the Peacock Inn, oftentimes those 160-acre estates. And then, of all places, Shenandoah, Little Havana. If you went today to one of the busiest intersections there, 17th Avenue and 8th Street, the famous Coyote Show, you'd find a nondescript gas station, to be generous, a nondescript gas station there. That was a site of the Belcher homestead in the 1890s, and they cultivated, among many things, pineapples. And then the next group that settled that land was a Hickson family, and they cultivated Hayden mangoes, said to have been invented by a couple farmers in the Miami area. So that was a very interesting place. The area is beginning to grow quickly. On the east side of 17th Avenue, you had Grapefruit Grove. All those trees went down when they converted that into a housing development known as Shenandoah in 1921. And then where Hickson Groves were, all the Hayden mango trees went down about 1923-24. They created another part of Shenandoah at that point. Because again, the city was beginning to grow very, very rapidly at that time. So we've got even Shenandoah very much landlocked. That's very much part of this scene here. The Miami River. Surprisingly, there wasn't a lot of farming activity on the river near its mouth, other than the fact that there were a couple of slave plantations in the 1830s and 1840s. You know very little about the 1840 plantation. We know a lot about the 1830 because a whole inventory was listed by the owner, Fitzpatrick, claiming damages during something called the Second Seminole War. So we have an idea, 16 enslaved people there, sort of equipment they worked with and what have you. Other than that, there wasn't a whole lot at the mouth of the river. For example, when the Brickles moved down in 1871, they didn't necessarily farm. They had a trading post, and they acquired land. But it wasn't a lot of farming going on there. On the other side, you had the old Fort Dallas complex, and there was small farming that went on there, but not too much. But as you go upriver, tremendous amount of farming. And if you fast forward this to 1897, in 1897, Miami was a year old, and a Massachusetts gentleman comes down. He had been a brigadier general in the Civil War, and he comes down to around 17th, 18th Avenue, General Samuel Lawrence. And he created a large dairy farm there, as well as fruit groves, especially orange groves there. And became a very popular place. In fact, his groves extended from the south bank of the river between roughly, well, we don't have to get into it, but somewhere around 13th Avenue over to about 19th Avenue. And they extended through what would today be the Marlin Ballpark, the Orange Bowl site. It was a very extensive property that we had there. And if you go a little bit further, you would also find additional farms in that area. So it wasn't really right at the top of the river itself, at the mouth, but it was as you move further along the river. I wanted to mention something to you, though. I know we only have a little while left, and we want to go to questions and answers very shortly. But I wanted to give you a sense of maybe how a lot of people lived at that time, and it was pretty simple, even with the farms and all the crops and what have you. Probably the longest lived Miamian family at the turn of the 1900s was the Wagner family, and they lived over where the Metro Rail station is today. It would be Colmer Park, known as Wagner Place at that time. And many members of the family and their children had lots of children and what have you. They moved out to the Cocoa Plum area, one of the family members did with their children. But this is what Adam Richards said. Adam Richards married one of the Wagner daughters. And he said that despite the abundance of farming and the fruits of their endeavors, he characterized the standard of living there as pretty low, as people lived on, and I'm quoting him here, potatoes and other easily grown vegetables, fish, bird, and venison. It was, he averred, and I'm quoting again, difficult to obtain other food items. You know, great irony there with all the types of foods that were being raised at that point. Let's look a little bit more at this, and then we're going to go to Q&A, and I'm just going to summarize the rest of what I was going to provide in the lecture. This is a festival, and all sorts of wonderful festivals in the Redlands, and some continue today. That was in the 30s. Here's a bean crop in Princeton. Princeton became very prominent also for celery, for cultivating celery. Princeton was first prominent because of a man named Gaston Drake, who graduated from Princeton when it was known as a college in New Jersey. And he was really enamored of the whole place. He painted all of his buildings in black and orange, which are the Princeton colors. He had a lumber mill there, and it was the biggest business in Dade County at one point. So you've got here bean crops, plowing at Cutler. Oof, looks pretty desolate. Here are the packing houses, and you're going to find them everywhere. This is an aerial shot of the Daring Estate. circa 1935. There's really little else there in terms of a built environment. You know, the housing projects we think of today were still many decades away at that point. Here we have looking at on Sunset Drive. Now this is where they moved. Once the railroad created a depot at the confluence of Sunset and US 1, it seems like the packing houses moved there, the families moved there, everything kind of shifted in that direction. Very smart move. See, Cutler didn't make that move because the railroad bypassed Cutler because the folks that owned property Cutler wanted to gouge Flagler, but Flagler, in today's money, would have been a billionaire. He didn't get to be a billionaire by, you know, being kind of trucked by people. So he just said, I'm not going to pay all that money for that, even though it's high ground. I'm going to move further inland where there's high ground also and run my rail through there. And that caused Cutler really to die as a community. Charles Daring then would begin to buy land in 1913 and create his building, his estate there. This is a familiar picture. That building is still there. Again, the Sunset and US 1. Aerial view of Coral Gables. Look at this. It's just getting underway. Merrick breaks ground on Coral Gables in late 1921. And by 1925, he's worth, on paper at least, between $75 and $100 million, according to several sources. Spraying melons. Now, here's the thing that's kind of scary. It says here, probably using DDT. I can remember as a boy in the summers, these planes spraying DDT to kill mosquitoes in the area. Strawberry Festival. Look at this. This is interesting. Sweetwater. And this brings up the Everglades because Sweetwater was part of the Everglades swampland. But when drainage came beginning in 1909 up the North Fork of the Miami River, places began to lose the water. The idea of draining the Everglades was to create rich farmland. The irony is, it's become so much of suburbia in these three counties. And this is interesting. We're up at 125th now in what we call Biscayne country. That would be the future Miami Shores and Biscayne Park, parts of North Miami, you know, all along the bay as it's curving in a northeasterly direction. It's like Australian pine trees in the background, grew very quickly. Here's the County plant. This guy Hearst, he ran a sawmill and he said, hey, the money is really in exporting the root of this plant converted into a starch. And so he had a big mill at 103rd and Northeast 2nd Avenue before he moved down to US 1 and Southwest 104th Street. That's the root of the plant, the sidekick. Gathering coconuts at Cape Florida, 1915. James Daring, our beloved builder of this place right here, he had the idea of creating a South Seas village in the southern part of Key Biscayne at one time, and then he abandoned the project and the idea. How are we doing? Okay? Okay, good. This is an overview of Key Biscayne getting ready for development. You've gone from coconut groves, 40,000 coconuts on Key Biscayne, owned by the Mathesons, who had about 1,700 out of the 2,400 acres that comprise Key Biscayne. And they're beginning to sell off land. The Rickenbacker Causeway's up and going. Crana Park is open. The zoo is there. What have you? Burning charcoal, the vegetable garden, slash pines, that they be young immature pine trees in the background there, creating a vegetable garden. Well, let's look at this now. Okay, so we have entered the wonderful Vizcaya, and the area across the street was known as the village, sometimes the farm. And what James Daring did was, in many ways, he wanted to make this place as self-sustaining as possible when it came to food. And so he used the land he had over there. He bought altogether about 180 acres, 130 initially, and then they bought land that would be part of today's Mercy Hospital, Immaculata de South School, high schools, later on to create something called the Lagoon. But this is the other side now, and they're beginning to clear the land for vegetable gardens. There'll be a greenhouse for flowers, a dairy farm, mechanic shop, superintendent's home, all these wonderful elements. And as far as I know, all those buildings are still standing. We took a look tonight before we came over here, and there they were. Here would be the greenhouse interior, 1916. Daring moved in here Christmas of 1916. Okay, so they're building the greenhouse at this point. The vegetable garden, look at this here, 1915. This is even before he arrives. Getting ready for everything. Piney woods in the background. You've gone from hammock land to piney woods, which has been cleared for this garden, and then you've got what's left behind it. Vegetable garden, 1915. Sand piles in South Garden. Piles of earth being trucked in. The rear of the chicken house, 1916. Trellis and vegetable garden, 1917. Another shot of the vegetable garden, same year. Really maturing. This would be the dairy farm, a dairy barn, I'm sorry. Mule stables. Mules provided a lot of the heavy lifting. South facade of the superintendent's house in the village. You got the complex here too. You got the dairy, the carriage house, the mule barn. Here's the kitchen garden. Superintendent's house in the background, those 3 arches. Wide view of the village. Let me just mention that, and we'll just back it up. I have something on the screen. Let me just mention that Daring had a very large staff here, James Daring did, and he wanted to take care of them as best he could. So a lot of what they ate actually came from the garden, came from the dairy, what have you. And if there was surplus stuff, some of that was sold to the general public or to companies or whatever. So we got access here preparing this. The folks here are just wonderful. They've got great archives, access to a ledger on the part of a man named McGinnis, who kept a financial ledger for the year 1922 and the amount of crops that were being planted, the amount of stuff they bought, the materials they bought, things they sold. They were selling different cattle, buying new cattle. Very, very interesting to see what was going on, but that was a major provider of food for a relatively large number of people who took care of this complex. So we have a little time for questions and answers? Great. Maria, how are we doing? We okay?
Time for some questions.
Okay, great. Questions anybody might have? Yes,
So I know that in the early to mid 19th century, I'm just going to grab it for you.
Sure.
So in the early to mid 19th century, agriculture was very much a gentleman's game, something that they would do on their estates and a lot of their own input into. And I wondered if it was the same in the 20th century, if Charles Deering was the one who decided what crops were grown in the village farm, or if he had hired a horticulturalist or trained farmers from elsewhere.
Well, I think that he probably leaned on the expertise of people that really were conversant with that. Because keep in mind, he was born in Maine, he lived in Chicago, had a place in Evanston, was a world traveler, was in Europe every summer. He had people who were specialists, I think, in everything. I would think he leaned on that. And he had people who were experts in the area. Dr. Fairchild, for example, sometimes he'll lend some wisdom to it also.
Mention Mabel Dorn, female.
Mabel, and I know the name, but I can't tell you much else.
Is the wife of the gentleman that wrote the Takesa article of the first mango
J.K.
farm.
Dorn. J.K. Dorn, yes.
Yes, they had the mango grove that was over by Sunset, but in terms of with agriculture being a female's game or a male's game, you had Mabel Dorn, which prominently was like the mother of horticulture. She was
Right.
into the societies, and they were the mango farmers. There's just so much, Dr. George. You've covered everything.
Well, he was a prize student of mine, actually. He's also an expert in guavas. If you ever have any ice cream over at Azucar or something, guava ice cream, it comes from his farm, which is really great. I wanted to mention something else about women in horticulture. I interviewed the son of William J. Crone, who was the primary developer of the Florida East Coast Railway in that area. He oversaw the construction of the Florida East Coast Railroad to Key West. Young guy from Wisconsin, brilliant engineer. I interviewed his son when he was in his 80s. I wrote a book on South Dade history about 30 years ago. And I said, I heard your father was really great, as a grower and a farmer. He said, my mother was better. Isabel Crone. Right away, corrected me right away that she was really the brains behind it. And that she'd come up with, through hybrid and whatever else, a new variety of avocados. So it was kind of interesting to hear that. Questions? Yes.
Dr. George, Sometimes I feel like we tend to minimize the influence of the Bahamians
Oh.
on these farms. My question for you is, what was that exchange between, obviously, Coconut Grove and the Bahamas? There seemed to be a constant flow of people between.
Yeah, much of it was seasonal. Much of it was during the growing season, so it'd be spring planting and early fall harvesting and what have you. So they were really citizens of, or residents of two communities. And their expertise was fantastic. And the way they looked upon it here was, the economy of the Bahamas was in very bad shape in the late 19th century. And they saw greater opportunities here. So they came here during the growing season and would go back there. But I've been intrigued with the whole Bahamian presence, especially the Black Bahamian presence, for decades. And my Little Havana book, a book I did in Little Havana, there was actually a neighborhood that would be today in Little Havana. It straddled 8th Street between 4th Avenue and 8th Avenue. This is during segregation, this is during Jim Crow. A black neighborhood, Bahamian, strictly, that was known as South Miami. It was gone by the 40s. And then if you went a little bit east, a little bit west of there, there was a white Bahamian neighborhood known as the Conch Hill neighborhood. There was some elevation there. But it was a draw of opportunities. There was a wonderful historian, Ray Moll, who wrote a Florida Historical Society article on Bahamians coming to South Florida in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And his thesis was that economic conditions there were really poor and there was good opportunity here. Questions anybody might have? Yes, Yeah, Princeton. Princeton's still around. It's it's on the west side of US 1 primarily. And could somebody give me the street, the rough street approximation of Princeton, 270th Street or something? It's way down there, but it's a very interesting place. Yeah, College Square would be, I guess, I'm thinking of Gould's with College Square. This is actually a little bit. 204th? Oh, it's way down there. It's even beyond that. 232 and south of there. Yeah, Jane Taylor's book, yeah. But it's an interesting place because this guy, Gaston Drake, had this huge lumber business there. And his wife said, I'm not living down there. So he would take the train, I think on a regular basis. They lived in Buena Vista Design District at one point. They lived on the east side of Biscayne Boulevard and 39th Street. And there was a depot over at 36th Street and Northeast 2nd Avenue, which is the West Dixie Highway. He would take the train down to work. You know, we oversaw the place. We published an article in Tequesta about 3 or 4 years ago from a Princeton graduate about Princeton. And it was quite a place. Sadly, there was a tragedy there. You always had a general store, which when automobiles became more recognized and what have you, also had a gas pump. And often in the general store, the people that ran it lived above it in an apartment. And so the Cash family lived down there, and they had a guy who was renting from them. He was a truck driver, and at that point, this was the late 1930s, celery was becoming a major crop there. The Princeton lumber yards had closed. And he kidnapped their son, who was about 6 or 7 years of age, and he killed him, sadly. And nobody could break the case. J. Edgar Hoover was down here. He was heading the FBI at that point. And he brought down 80, quote, G-men. That's what they called FBI people that time, the government. The J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI.
No, what year?
1938. So he couldn't crack the case, and then a Dade County sheriff said, you know, you brought this guy in, his name is D.C. Coleman, the sheriff, you brought this guy in, William Franklin McCall, and his story sounds pretty shaky, and plus he lives on the property there. And so they brought William Franklin McCall back, and they broke him down, and he said, yeah, I did it. He was holding up for $5,000 ransom and killed the kid. And it was headlines all over the country. There have been about 2 or 3 books written on it. And he's buried at a cemetery off of 8th Street, about 43rd, just west of Lejeune Road, sadly. But that was a huge thing. And then as time went on, that community grew. I mean, there's maybe 10, 12,000 people living there. It's not a municipality, so it doesn't have formal borders. But that's kind of like a ballpark idea of it, Princeton. But again, named by the guy that had the big business there and owned that property, named for his alma mater, which ironically was called the College of New Jersey when he was there. The name wasn't changed to Princeton until the end of the 1890s. Questions anybody might have? Yes,
Dr. George, I have a simple question.
Sorry.
I moved to Florida, I could not do it. The bugs always got to them. I was wondering if you have any idea, how are these also immigrants like myself were able to succeed? Is it because they counted on Bahamian knowledge? How were they able to do something that I can't do?
Well, it's a $64 question. I think it was really hard work and just they didn't have an alternative. I mean, they were here in the middle of nowhere in many ways. With families, they just had to. And I think people help people an awful lot. I got that sense when I was reading about George Merrick when he came down from Massachusetts that, the people around him, they kind of looked at these Northeasterners, what are you guys doing here? But at the same time, they started helping them a lot. And there were a lot of both white and black Bahamians working those 160-acre plots in today's Coral Gables at that time. In fact, they called the Bahamians Saws, short for Nassau. They called them Saws. But I just think it was hard work and the urgency of it. You just couldn't fail. You had to stay here. You had to somehow do it. We'll take a final. Okay. Yes, huh? Yes. Yes. That's a great question, and I'm a layman, of course. I'm not an agriculturalist. You really can't plant them in long rows. They grow in piney woods, and it's almost like by magic they spring up. They actually ran out of them because everything has been concreted or cemented over.
Extirpated.
So yeah, they definitely were extirpated, but they're gone. But this A.B. Hearst was amazing because he had the largest business going on in what we call Biscayne country, and he decided to move down because he was running out of the cycad plant. He decided to move down where there were a whole bunch of cycads, again at 104th and US 1. There was a Jefferson's there at one time and a Fuddruckers and what have you. In that area, it was piney woods and it was filled with them. One of the things that happened was in World War I, men who had been gassed by German mustard gas and couldn't hold anything in their system, when somebody bit down on a Kunti biscuit and it stayed down. And so the orders went out, we want every bit of that Kunti you can send over to us. And by the end of the war, that had been more or less exhausted, that supply. Hearst was part of the group that sent it over. But that was the one thing that a gas soldier could retain. Yes,
I just want to add something to that. The Kunti plant is the host plant for the Atala.
For the Atala butterfly, yes.
That was almost extinct because of the Kunti.
Because the Kunti vanished. I was getting ready for a tour in Coconut Grove. It had to be long before Ingrid and Hannah were making me look good as a tour guide. This was maybe 20 years ago, and I was there a little bit early for the tour at the Barnacle. And there was a little Kunti plant there, cycad. There was an Italia butterfly flying around it. There it was. And it was just a tiny plant. But boy, I'm telling you, I'm sure she or he really searched it out. They needed that plant. I want to thank you all so much for joining us. You have a question?
I just want to say you did an incredible job, Dr. George.
Oh, thank you.
If this is retirement looks like, I'm ready for retirement. So we're getting ready to renovate and revitalize the village across the street. So I just want your advice on what you think we should do.
Oh, boy. Well, you've kept up, and I've thought about it a lot because you've kept up all those wonderful structures, and now you're resuscitating an area where, incidentally, one of the first talks I ever gave, I finished my PhD at Florida State at the end of the 70s. One of the first talks I gave was for the Historical Association of Southern Florida, right over there where the village was, because that's where History Miami was from 1972 until 1984. And that was way back at the end of the 70s.
Before my time.
Yeah, before your time. But I've often thought you've got Bay Heights there, a really affluent neighborhood, and that was all part of the village and the farm, although it probably wasn't developed as much as the part that would be east of there. But I think you're going to do a great job. You've got the bones there, you've got the buildings there, and you're already beginning to lay out a little bit of a farming area there. I think you're going to be in great shape. Can't wait to see it as it goes on. Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Dr. George.
Thank you.